You were never meant to hear this, but now you have, and once you know, there is no going back. The records say the Morwyn name was erased in 1856, but that's not true. It was buried, quietly, deliberately, by men in robes, by women who knew the hymns but stopped singing. Not because they forgot, but because hearing it again would bring it back. There is a house not marked on any map. It sits east of Dunmere Valley, on a slope where no birds fly and no soil stays warm. People call it the Hollow Spire, though there is no spire, just 3 stories of black wood, a single lantern that never burns out, and a door that opens for no one, unless it remembers you. The Morwyns lived there, or they withered there. They were once priests, royal advisors, midwives of kings and confessors to generals. But somewhere between lineage and legacy they turned, not away from the divine, but toward something older, something that fed them in whispers. Each generation bore a sign, a second shadow in the moonlight, a faint hum beneath the walls, a child born without a cry. By the time they settled the Hollow Spire in 1821, the house wasn't a home, it was a pact, a cathedral turned inside out, and what they worshipped wasn't God, it was something beneath, something they called the rooted silence, a hunger that doesn't devour flesh, it devours memory. They say it began with a name scratched into stone, not written, scratched, like it fought the hand that etched it. Morwyn. The stone was found in an abbey cellar in 1794. A nun cleaning beneath the altar uncovered it behind a bricked wall sealed with wax and bone. She was mute by nightfall. They say she tried to speak but choked on something wet. She died 2 days later with blood on her teeth and ash beneath her tongue. The stone was taken, of course, shipped in secret to the ecclesiastical archives in Ghent, labeled non-canonical relic, origin unknown. That label was scratched out within a week. No one claimed responsibility, but 2 scholars vanished. The third, Father Corrigan, went blind reading the inscription under candlelight. He claimed the words moved, that they rearranged themselves when spoken aloud. He died repeating a phrase that appears nowhere in Scripture. The mouth is closed, but the hunger speaks. And so it was hidden again, deep beneath the earth in an iron vault lined with salt and silver. But not before someone copied the markings, not before the Morwyn family found them. They didn't see blasphemy, they saw instructions. That same year, they withdrew from public life, sold their lands in France, dismantled the chapel their family had funded for centuries, and crossed the ocean under false names. They brought with them an infant, unbaptized, swaddled in veils stitched with unreadable script. And something else, a book bound in pale leather, no title, no author, just a mark on the cover, a single eye sewn shut with black thread. They never opened it in daylight, they never spoke of what it contained, but their descendants would call it the first veil, and its first commandment was clear: silence is the oldest prayer. The Morwyns did not settle in a town, they circled one. Dunmere Valley was young then, a handful of farmsteads, a small chapel, a schoolhouse with no bell. It was quiet, unwatched, just close enough for visits, just far enough to avoid suspicion. They built their estate on a ridge no one claimed, no deed, no survey, just timber, stone, and something buried before the foundation was poured. The house rose in 7 days. Locals said they worked through the night, lanterns glowing from within the trees. No wagons, no teams of oxen, just silhouettes that moved in silence, faster than men should. And that the smoke from their fires smelled wrong, like sage and copper and teeth. By the 8th day, the Morwyns were no longer seen. The doors were closed, the curtains drawn, but children who wandered too far up the slope said they heard things, humming, not melody. Vibration, like something massive breathing beneath the soil. They saw women in gray dresses walking in pairs between the trees, barefoot even in frost, leaving no prints. Some carried books, others carried infants wrapped in wet cloth. One boy claimed he saw a man kneeling beside a shallow pit, whispering to something below. He said it whispered back. He was found the next morning in his bed, his hands folded over his stomach, dirt packed beneath every fingernail. He never spoke again, but he drew endlessly. Circles within circles, eyes inside roots, and a spiral staircase with no top, descending only into black. The Morwyns had begun their work, not to build a house, but to prepare a threshold, because the rooted silence does not come where it is not invited. And what they invited was not a spirit, it was a language, one that could reshape the mind. Every true power begins with a word. But the language the Morwyns spoke was not meant for tongues. It was older than sound, older than breath. They called it the silent lexicon, a system of unspoken transmission, not through voice, but through gesture, ritual, and willing submission. Those who learned it didn't speak it, they became it. The Morwyn matriarch, Seraphine, was the first to master its cadence. She had once trained in a cloister near Lyon, where the nuns fasted in silence for 33 days to memorize divine geometries. But what she brought to Dunmare was not geometry, it was structure, the bones of something ancient draped in modern flesh. She instructed the household in movements, not prayers. She turned their mealtimes into rites, their sleep into surveillance, their wombs into instruments. Every child born to the Morwyn line was marked, not in ink, in absence. Absence of crying, absence of blinking, absence of reflection. The mirrors in the hollow spire were turned to the walls before a child could walk, because children spoke early, and often in their sleep, and sometimes in voices that were not theirs. At 6, they were taken into the orchard, blindfolded, spun in place, and left to find their way back with nothing but instinct. The ones who failed were brought home, fed honey and milk, then taken below. No one ever heard them again. But the next morning, their beds were still warm and their pillows damp, as if someone had returned to weep. This was not cruelty, not to the Morwyns. This was refinement, because they believed that only the emptied soul could house the unutterable truth, and that obedience was the only language God still heard. Except it wasn't God they were speaking to. It was something older. By 1825, the orchard had changed. The trees no longer bore fruit, but they bloomed, out of season, in colors no botanist could name. The bark thickened, then peeled, revealing veined patterns beneath, like tissue, like flesh. Their roots no longer obeyed gravity. They curled upward from the soil, twisting toward the house, toward the basement, like veins seeking a heart. Locals began avoiding the eastern ridge, not because of what they saw, but because of what they felt. An unease that wasn't fear, it was recognition. The feeling you get when you sense something watching but know that it has no eyes. Children began sleepwalking, always east. One girl was found outside the orchard gate, her hands folded, whispering, "They sing beneath the stairs." She was 6. That same year, 3 farmers disappeared. Each had been hired to deliver timber near the Morwyn estate. Their wagons returned empty, their horses soaked with sweat, and the nails that held the wheels in place were all bent outward. The sheriff sent a search party. Only one man came back. He had no shoes, no coat, and his right ear was gone, cleanly removed. When questioned, he said only, "They listened through the roots." He never spoke again. His tongue, doctors discovered, had turned black, not from rot, from ink. The Morwyn house remained undisturbed, no smoke from the chimney, no light from the windows. And yet, every Sunday at dusk, a low hum would echo from the trees, not a song, a frequency. Like something deep beneath the orchard was calling its children back. But what answered wasn't human, and it wasn't done calling. You have to understand something. The Morwyns weren't possessed, they weren't cursed, they were initiated. Every generation was a refinement, each child a vessel, each death an offering, and each silence a doorway. They believed knowledge was infection, that once you learned the true shape of the world, you couldn't unlearn it. So they taught in riddles, in dreams, in actions, not facts, frequencies. It began with subtraction. A child would go a day without speaking, then a week without mirrors, then a month without being touched. The silence made them soft, the stillness made them open, and into that void they poured the whisper doctrine. It was not written, it was engraved, into bone, wax, and memory. The doctrine taught that the world was not created by light, but by listening. that before God spoke, something else had been listening. Still is. They called it the mouth below, not metaphor, not myth, location. A place they believed ran beneath Dunmere Valley, beneath the orchard, beneath even their own bloodlines, a source, an echo that never stopped humming. By 1830, even townsfolk not of Morwyn blood had begun to hear it, not in words, in impulses. A farmer's wife drowned her twins in the cistern. She said they'd already gone back to the roots. A blacksmith nailed shut his own ears. When asked why, he mouthed, "To hear clearly." And the preacher, Father Emmerich, was found at the altar with every page of scripture torn out and swallowed. No blood, just silence. The kind that vibrates. By then it was too late. The orchard wasn't growing trees, it was growing memory. And memory, once it deepens enough, becomes prophecy. There are places where reality thins, not haunted, not cursed, just porous. The orchard became one of them. By 1832, people stopped referring to it directly. They called it the hush, the hollowing, the edge. They wouldn't point toward it. They wouldn't walk facing it. Children were taught to turn their heads when passing by, as if eye contact alone could invite something in. But the Morwyns, they walked straight through, barefoot, bareheaded, as if the orchard weren't a place but a promise. It was during this time that the first known disappearance without return occurred. A 12-year-old boy named Lucian Fennell wandered into the orchard during a dare. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He simply vanished. But 4 days later, his voice returned. Not his body, just his voice. It was heard by his sister standing in the attic. It whispered her name from beneath the floorboards, soft, measured. "Hollow me, hollow me, hollow me." She was found hours later, catatonic. A thorn carved into her chest in the shape of a spiral. The same spiral sketched again and again in the Morwyn children's journals. By then, local authorities were paralyzed. No proof, no cause, just patterns, and the spreading dread of shared silence. But behind the boarded-up windows of the Morwyn estate, the rituals grew stronger. They began planting objects instead of seeds. A tooth, a shard of mirror, a coin without a face, and the soil accepted them. Because the orchard was no longer fed by rain, it was fed by memory. And memory, when seeded in blood and silence, grows roots that speak back. By winter of 1834, the Morwyn house no longer matched the blueprints it was built from. The windows had multiplied, but none looked out. They looked in. Doors led to rooms no one remembered building. A stairwell spiraled downward for 13 steps, then ended in dirt, packed and humming. And at the center of the house, beneath a hatch carved with the symbol of a tongue folded thrice, was the listening room. No furniture, no light, just salt-rubbed stone and the faint sound of breathing. It said the Morwyns would sit there for hours, sometimes days, not speaking, not sleeping, just listening. To what? To him, the mouth below, not a demon, not a god, a resonance, a presence so ancient it predated thought itself, and once you heard it, it rewrote you. Visitors to the estate, rare as they were, always left altered. A school inspector sent to survey the property returned mute and covered in welts shaped like characters no known alphabet contained. A nursemaid hired to tend the youngest Morwyn heir went blind in one eye, yet claimed to see more clearly than ever before. She described roots beneath the floor, not wood, not plant, veins, pulsing, breathing, coiling tighter each year around the house's foundation, pulling it downward, not collapsing, feeding, and every child born within those walls was part of the contract, part of the architecture. Their silence wasn't innocence, it was currency. Because the Morwyns had made an agreement, in exchange for silence, they would receive remembrance, but not the kind you'd want, not the kind that fades, the kind that lingers in bloodlines, like rot behind the walls. There is a memory buried in every man. You don't remember it consciously, but it lives in the marrow, in the instincts that make your skin crawl at dead silence, the reflex to look away from the dark corner of a room. The Morwyns knew this, and they learned to harvest it. They called it the deep recall. It wasn't about remembering your past. It was about awakening something older, something primal, a memory that doesn't belong to you. They believed the body carries echoes of the first hunger, the first obedience, the first silence, and they believed those echoes could be stirred by pain, by rhythm, by ritualized forgetting. One child, Elias Morwyn, was kept in darkness for 7 years. No names, no clocks, just breath, heartbeat, and the hum of the rooted silence. When she emerged, she didn't speak, but she wrote. Pages and pages of spiraling glyphs in blood and ink. When a scholar from the seminary tried to translate them, he wept. Not because he understood, because he recognized. Lines from dreams he'd had since childhood, symbols he'd drawn as a boy, with no memory of why. He hung himself the next day. No note, only one phrase carved into his desk. It remembers me when I sleep. This is what the Morwyns tapped into, not power, pattern. A deeper algorithm beneath faith, language, and time itself. They didn't want domination, they wanted continuity, a line from them to whatever lay beneath the orchard, something that could not die, because it had never truly lived, and so the house stood. Not as a residence, but as an organ. A breathing part of a larger body, one that waits, one that listens, one that knows your name. By 1836, the orchard had become something else. It was no longer made of trees. Not really. They still looked like trees from a distance, trunks, branches, leaves. But up close the illusion failed. Their bark pulsed, their leaves curled inward like listening ears. And when wind passed through them, it didn't sound like rustling, it sounded like breathing. The Morwyns walked between them daily, barefoot, heads bowed, hands clasped behind their backs like penitents. Except they weren't repenting, they were feeding it. Each branch was marked, each root traced with blood. Some said the orchard had become their cathedral. A place of worship, yes, but not toward heaven, toward depth. It was during this time that outsiders began to vanish entirely. No blood, no footprints, just absence. A postman's horse returned with every letter undelivered and its rider's boots filled with ash. A schoolteacher followed a child's voice into the woods and was never seen again. But her bell rang every day at dusk from nowhere, for 7 nights straight. And yet, the Morwyns were never questioned, because they were never accused, because no one had the language to accuse them, not in court, not in prayer. By then, the town had grown strangely docile, passive, like something in the soil had taught it to forget. Those who remembered fled. But even they had dreams, of roots wrapping the lungs, of voices calling from beneath floorboards, of children with no mouths, smiling. One woman drew what she saw. An enormous tree whose limbs ended in hands. It grew upside down, its trunk descending into the earth wider with each ring. She titled the sketch, The Listening Root, and beneath it she wrote 7 words. He doesn't need worship, just memory. Memory is the most dangerous currency, not because it reveals, but because it anchors. The Morwyns understood this in a way no clergy, no monarchy, no scholar ever did. They didn't store memory in books. They buried it, in flesh, in bloodlines, in the silent gaze of a child staring just a second too long. One of their most secret rites was called the receding. It took place once every 9 years, always beneath a new moon when no light could interfere. Only 3 things were needed: a child who had not yet spoken, a hole lined with salt and bone, and the book without ink. This book wasn't read, it was worn, pressed to the chest until the heartbeat aligned with the pages, and when it did, the book turned warm. The child would convulse, not in pain, but in translation. Because this was the final truth the Morwyns had unlocked, that language is not taught, it is transferred. After the rite, the child would be taken inside, and for 7 days, no one would approach them, not even the mother. On the 8th day, the child would speak, but never in a voice anyone recognized. One of them, a girl named Altha, spoke backward for 3 full years. every sentence perfectly mirrored. When played in reverse, the words formed prayers to something unnameable. A seminary priest brought in to correct her left the estate sobbing. He confessed to remembering a dream he never had in a place he'd never seen, being told his own birth name from beneath the floor. He took a vow of silence, cut out his own tongue. They say it twitched for hours afterward, and still, the orchard grew, not with life, but with retained death, because once something is remembered deeply enough, it starts to remember you. By the winter of 1839, the land itself began to warp, not visibly, but experientially. Time lagged near the Morwyn estate. Voices echoed before they were spoken. Smoke from the hearth curled downward instead of rising, and shadows no longer obeyed the sun. A surveyor named Callum Bray tried to map the property. He walked east at sunrise and returned just before midnight, but he claimed only 15 minutes had passed. His watch agreed, but the moon did not. He'd drawn only one sketch before he collapsed on the chapel steps. It showed the Morwyn house as it was, but inverted beneath the ground. A perfect mirror of the estate, upside down. Its roots spiraled like ribs. Its windows were sealed mouths, and at the center, a chamber labeled only the throat. He never sketched again. They locked him in the sanatorium west of Berwick Hollow, but even there the drawings kept appearing, scratched into wood, into walls, into the skin of his own forearms. Each time, the inverted house, the sealed mouths, the word throat. By now, the orchard was no longer a rumor. It was a field of containment. Salt rings were reinforced every equinox, candles burned in reverse spiral, and no animal crossed the property line willingly. Even birds avoided it, and when they didn't, they fell mid-flight, not dead, but hollow, feathers intact, bones untouched, but no weight, as if something had drained them from the inside out. That year, the last child born into the Morwyn family came silent. Her skin was marked with sigils before her first breath, and when she opened her eyes, every candle in the house went out. She had no name. They called her only She Who Listens First. There are names you speak, and then there are names that speak you. She Who Listens First was never recorded in town ledgers. No birth date, no baptism, not even the midwife remembered delivering her. But she was real, unmistakably real, and every Morwyn who looked into her eyes grew suddenly quiet, like they'd heard a sound too loud to register. She never spoke. But things happened when she was near. Knives rusted in drawers, glass fogged from the inside, and the walls began to breathe. The Morwyns called it the settling, as if the house was adjusting to her weight, and the orchard responded too. New trees sprouted in spirals around the estate. They grew fast, overnight, and not from seeds, from remains, shards of bone wrapped in linen, teeth threaded on copper wire. A string of vertebrae, still pink with marrow. The roots drank them in, and the trees sang, not with sound, but with memory. Visitors described flashes, moments not their own. A child's hand letting go of a rope swing. A woman burying a book behind her spine. A boy standing at a cellar door whispering, "He's not done listening." The child, she who listens first, began sleeping beneath the floorboards, voluntarily. And when she emerged, always at dusk, she carried objects in her hands. Once a brass key etched with an alphabet no one could read. Once a baby tooth she swore she hadn't lost yet. And once, a mirror, cracked, but not shattered. When she held it to the orchard, the reflection showed more trees than existed. Rows and rows, reaching farther than the horizon allowed, and in the furthest line, a figure stood, tall, still, faceless, watching. By the summer of 1840, Wren's Hollow no longer recognized itself. Shutters stayed closed even at noon. The church bell hadn't rung in months, and the townspeople began speaking in half-phrases, as if finishing a sentence would summon something. But the Morwyn estate thrived, not in wealth, not in power, in density. The house grew inward, walls thickened, staircases shifted. Visitors reported feeling tilted, like walking through a dream that refused to end. And the girl, she who listens first, became its anchor. She slept beneath the boards. She drank no water, and yet she bloomed, her skin pale but flushed with something just beneath, something moving. One local physician was granted a single examination. He opened her eyelids and collapsed, not from fear, from recognition. He wept as he whispered, "There's no pupil, just a spiral, just the orchard turning inward forever." He slit his wrists before morning. His final note, "Tell her I remember." Around that time, the orchard began to resist removal. A group of 6 men with axes attempted to clear a row of trees. None returned, but their axes did, left on the Morwyn porch, cleaned and still wet with sap that smelled like salt and copper. Rumors spread that the trees were shifting, not growing, repositioning, creating a circle, a perimeter, and in the center of that circle, a stone slab rose from the earth. Not carved, not placed, exhumed, it bore no inscription, just a shallow basin at its center, stained dark, never dry. The Morwyns called it the listening font, and at dusk each night the girl would press her forehead to the stone and whisper something no one ever repeated, because those who heard it forgot everything else. There comes a moment when silence stops being absence and becomes presence. That's what happened to the town of Wren's Hollow by the autumn of 1840. It didn't fall, it dimmed, not all at once. First, the hymns stopped being sung in tune. Then, children began waking with blood at the corners of their mouths, none of it their own. And then, most quietly of all, the people stopped leaving, not because they couldn't, because they forgot why they ever would. The Morwyn estate was no longer just a house on a hill. It was a gravity well, pulling memory, speech, identity down into its roots. And the girl, she who listens first. She had not aged, but her voice had. She still never spoke aloud, but her presence began to carry sound, a hum, low, measured, constant. At first you only heard it when she passed you, then it came from the walls, then the floorboards, and eventually from inside your own mouth. People began sleepwalking. They gathered at the orchard in the fog hours before dawn, barefoot, eyes open but unseeing. Some stood still for hours, heads tilted, others dug their own names into the soil with fingernails, as if planting themselves. And always, always, that hum. The preacher, the last one brave enough to remain, recorded in his journal, "I tried to drown it out with the bell. But the bell refused to ring. I shouted Psalm 23 into the orchard, and the trees whispered it back, in reverse. This is not possession. This is replacement." And what replaced them? Something older than the cross, older than scripture, older than even language. It didn't demand belief, only recognition, and once you recognized it, it never let go. There is a reason forgotten things stay buried, not because they are weak, but because they are foundational. The Morwyns discovered this through the chamber of below, a room not listed in any plan, a room that only revealed itself to those who had been emptied. It was not dug, it descended. Those who entered it spoke of air that thickened like syrup, of stone that pulsed beneath the hand, and of whispers that did not echo, because they came from inside the chest. They said it wasn't a room, it was a womb, but not for birth, for reversal. What happened there was called the unbecoming, the process by which memory is boiled down into essence, then offered back to the soil. A trade, a tithe. Not everyone survived it, but those who did came back quiet, changed. Their eyes did not move together, their reflections blinked a beat too late, and they smelled faintly of iron, salt, and lavender. The girl, she who listens first, was often seen there. Not as a priestess, not as a leader, but as a tether. It was said she held open the door between thought and hunger, between silence and command, between who you were and what the orchard needed you to become. Because by then, it was clear, the orchard was no longer just alive. It was aware, and it didn't want blood, it didn't want worship, it wanted remembrance. But not yours, its own. And the Morwyns were simply the flesh it used to recall itself. That's the danger of dark knowledge. The more you uncover, the more it begins to remember you. Some legacies are carved in stone, others are whispered through generations of silence. By 1841, the Morwyn name was no longer spoken in Wren's Hollow. not by decree, by instinct. Mothers would slap the tongue of a child who said it. Old men would cough blood mid-sentence rather than finish it. And yet, the house still stood, the orchard still grew, and she who listens first still listened. But something had shifted, because the outside world had begun to notice. A team of theologians, sanctioned by the Central Presbytery, arrived that spring, sent to investigate the unnatural weather, the declining church attendance, and the rumors of unsanctioned rites. They never made it to the estate. 3 disappeared en route. 1 returned, barefoot, naked from the waist down, cradling an empty satchel. He kept muttering the same phrase, "They bloom in the spine." When asked who, he vomited orchard bark. No roots, just bark, shaved thin as vellum, still damp and folded like pages. He died before morning, mouth open, tongue absent, and still, no arrests, no search warrants. Because every outsider who came close either lost the trail or found something they couldn't explain. One woman, a scholar of ancient languages, claimed the estate's layout mirrored an archaic glyph used in pre-Sumerian funerary rites, a symbol for that which hears back. She said the Morwyns hadn't designed the house. They had been instructed, not by voice, by impulse, drawn plans in sleep, paced dimensions from instinct, built a structure not to shelter, but to summon. And what they summoned wasn't a spirit, wasn't a curse. It was a pattern, one designed to replicate itself, not in blueprints, but in bloodlines. Every pattern seeks continuity, and when it finds a vessel, it writes itself in flesh. By the fall of 1841, the Morwyn children no longer cried at birth. They hummed, low, melodic, and identical across generations. One midwife, brought from Berwick Hollow under false name, delivered twin boys in the attic of the estate. She said the moment they emerged, their eyes opened in unison. No wailing, no gasp for air, only synchronized breathing, as if they were resuming something. She left the estate just before dawn, trembling, blouse stained with salt across the chest. She wrote a single letter to her sister. They were born remembering, not just themselves, but the space between things. I saw the gap open, and it looked back. The letter ended there. She was found 3 days later beneath the chapel floorboards, still breathing, but never awake again. The townspeople whispered that the Morwyns had done something wrong, but that was the lie. They had done something perfect. She who listens first had begun marking the children. Not with ink, with gesture. A touch to the forehead, a whisper behind the ear, a silent motion across the chest, a spiral drawn backward with a single finger. And with each marking the orchard deepened, not wider, not taller, downward. The roots began showing through the earth, coils of blackened wood, smooth as polished stone. Some say the roots no longer connected to trees, they connected to rooms, rooms with no doors, no floors. Just memory suspended in air, waiting for someone to inhale it. Because the deeper the pattern etched itself into blood and soil, the more self-aware the estate became, and something beneath it began to dream. Dreams are not fiction, not in the Morwyn house. Their dreams are instructions. By winter's end of 1841, no one near the estate slept through the night. Those who did, returned, changed. A farmer named Eben Vell claimed he saw the house in his sleep, not from above, but from below. He stood in a vast chamber, ribs arching overhead like cathedral beams, stone floor breathing beneath his bare feet. He walked for hours, through rows of cradles. Each one rocked, slowly, empty. But they all hummed, the same tune, over and over. He awoke to find soil packed beneath his fingernails and ash smeared beneath both eyes. He never entered a church again. He said, "It's not that they feed it, it's that they echo it." Because that's what the Morwyn estate had become by then, not a house, not even a temple, but an amplifier. A structure designed not just to contain, but to project, downward and outward. Everything had been arranged with ritual precision. 7 gables, 4 chimneys, 9 interior thresholds. 13 windows that never opened. Each architectural line aligned to a geometry of resonance, a harmonic grid built not on music, but on remembrance. Because beneath the house, the orchard, the graves no one admitted to digging, the listener stirred, not awake, not yet, but dreaming through them. Its thoughts bled upward like smoke through floorboards. And the Morwyns? They didn't resist. They translated. Their speech slowed. Their writing became spiral-bound loops, and their dreams began sinking, entire conversations conducted in sleep, in perfect chorus, spoken in a language no one taught but all remembered, because it was older than language. It was the sound a grave makes when it forgets its full. Every cathedral has a bell, but the Morwyn estate had something else. A mouth, hidden deep beneath the orchard, beneath the roots, beneath even the chamber of below. There was a space known only as the calling place. It wasn't entered, it was descended into, and only by those who had given up their names. By 1842, 5 Morwyns had done so, not out of sacrifice, out of fulfillment, because the name is the final shackle. Once it's removed, the flesh becomes transmissive. It no longer filters memory, it hosts it. Those who entered the calling place returned silent, but each bore a new mark, burned behind the ear, just beneath the skull, a spiral with no center. One girl, barely 10, emerged grinning, mouth full of blood, not hers. She left poems written backward on the chapel wall. When read through a mirror, they formed questions, but none were meant for us. They were meant for it, and it was answering, not in speech, in phenomenon. Rain fell upward for 13 seconds on the first day of May. A newborn was delivered without a heart, but lived for 7 hours, blinking in sync with the clock tower bell, and the trees. They began to whisper, no wind, no birds, just bark creaking in perfect phrased intervals. A linguist who spent 3 nights recording them collapsed upon transcription. He wrote, "They're not speaking, they're remembering, not just their own lives, but ours." He burned his equipment and his left hand, said it tried to write on its own. The Morwyn estate was no longer isolated. It was spreading, not through land, but through inheritance. Because once the pattern takes root, it doesn't need your belief. It only needs your memory. Cited an entire hymn in reverse Latin, then gouged out his own tongue and wept without pain. He smiled, not mad, liberated, because the pattern, once awakened, seeks not to destroy, it seeks to reproduce. The Morwyns had become its first symphony. Now it required a chorus, and that's when the book appeared. Not delivered, not mailed, not written, remembered. On the desk of Reverend Elam Grigsby, a text bound in black hide, no title, just a single spiral burned into its spine. He didn't recall opening it, but he knew its contents. Each page was etched in pressure, raised glyphs that pulsed when read aloud. Not in English, not in Hebrew, something older, something consonant-heavy and fluid, like water folding through iron. He tried to burn it. The flames receded. He tried to bury it. The ground resisted. He left it on the chapel steps and ran. But it followed. Everywhere he went, it reappeared, until he finally opened it to the first line, and read, "To those who would remember the first listening, empty your name and tilt your house. The root must be exposed." That night, he walked into the orchard, naked, mouth sewn shut, carrying the book like an offering. They never found his body, only a new tree where none had grown, roots coiled like a spine, leaves pale as bone, and beneath the bark, words, your words. There is a line no man remembers crossing, only that once you do, you never speak the same again. By late 1842, the Morwyn estate no longer needed visitors. It called them. Through dreams, through faint music heard at dusk, through the scent of salt and lavender rising from the soil like incense. Men came in secret, women came in trance, children came laughing, and left silent. No gates, no invitation, just a pull. And every one of them, once touched by the orchard, returned marked. sometimes with spiral brands behind the ear, sometimes with a word whispered once in sleep and never spoken again, and sometimes with nothing visible at all until they stared too long into a mirror and saw something blink behind their reflection. It was Elsie Morwyn, now nearing her 7th year, who gave the estate its next shape, not in architecture, but in gesture. She began to trace symbols in soot on the hearthstones. She braided her hair into shapes resembling glyphs. She hummed not melodies, but keys. Tones that opened things. Cupboards unlocked, drawers slid out. And once, terrifyingly, a mouth appeared in the stone wall and whispered a single name. Remembrance. From that night on, the children of Wren's Hollow stopped being born with navels. Midwives wept but said nothing. Mothers rocked them just the same. But the men, they began to fade. Not die, just blur. Their voices dimmed, their shadows thinned, and eventually they vanished from records, as if the orchard had erased them from history, like a hand smoothing soil over a grave never meant to be marked. And still, the trees grew, but no longer from seed, from words, forgotten ones, buried ones. And the roots, they didn't drink water, they drank memory. Some houses rot, others evolve. By the winter solstice of 1842, the Morwyn estate was no longer a structure. It had become an organism, not living, not dead, but aware and adjusting. The stairs no longer led to the same places. Doors appeared where none had been, marked with chalk sigils that smeared only when touched with blood. Mirrors reflected rooms that did not exist, and once, a second face behind the viewer's own. The attic ceiling grew lower each week, not collapsing, listening, and beneath it all, in the heart of the house, something pulsed. Not a sound, not a breath, a beat, slow, deliberate, and synchronized with the orchard's whispering. Some began calling it the false heart. It wasn't placed there. It was grown there, rooted in a circle of salt-soaked floorboards, beneath which the soil churned like muscle. Elsie Morwyn now moved only in silence, her eyes always scanning corners as if receiving instructions no one else could see. And those who followed her, her kin, though not all by blood, began to dress in linen robes stitched with backward scripture. They no longer answered to their names. Instead, they responded to tones, high hums, clicking teeth, even the sound of wind through the orchard. It was no longer worship, it was synchronization. Their bodies had become instruments, their mouths, conduits. And what they spoke was no longer theirs. They began writing on walls, not paper. They carved glyphs into beams, sewed them into the hems of garments, whispered them into the ears of sleeping infants. And everywhere the glyphs appeared, dreams changed. Strangers began drawing spirals in their sleep. Men hundreds of miles away woke weeping, whispering the name Morwyn with terror and reverence, because the house had breached containment. It had entered the collective memory, and once it's in, it never leaves. They always say a curse dies with its last name. But what if the name isn't the curse? What if it's the invitation? By early 1843, the Morwyn name had vanished from every town ledger. Births unrecorded, deaths unnamed, marriages witnessed by no one but trees that now leaned inward, as if eavesdropping. And yet, the family grew, not in number, in depth. Those who entered the estate didn't just vanish. They recurred, same faces, same eyes, different voices, different functions. You'd see a man from 3 winters ago appear again in the orchard, same gait, same scar above the eye, but now tending soil with hands that moved like roots. He would not speak, only nod, as if he'd been reborn into a memory the land required, because that's what the pattern had become, a mechanism of memory, not to recall the past, but to repeat it until perfected. And when the town tried to intervene, tried to name, to reclaim, to bring light to the darkness, the pattern shifted. Wren's Hollow began to fold inward, not destroy itself, but simplify. Homes emptied. Clocks stopped. Voices grew measured, then fewer, then silent. Even time forgot the place. Letters postmarked there returned unread. Maps excluded the hills entirely. And the church bell, once rusted and cracked, was heard ringing again, but only in dreams. That spring, a traveler from Calthorne awoke on the road near the orchard. He remembered nothing but a phrase spoken by a woman with split pupils. "You are the 13th echo. Remember yourself, or we will." He returned home. Drew the Morwyn estate from memory, detailed, perfect, down to the missing shutters and bowed rafters. But he had never been. And in the margin of his sketchbook, a phrase was scrawled in dried lavender ink. "We tilt the house so the soul may pour in." Some knowledge is not learned, it's recovered, and once it returns, you are never alone again. By the end of 1843, the Morwyn estate had become a reflection, not of one house, but of every house that hides a secret. The orchard no longer bore fruit, yet birds never nested there. Instead, they hovered, still, wings trembling as if caught in decision, and beneath the roots, more than memory stirred. There were voices, soft, layered, receding as you approached, not from fear, but from strategy. Because by now the pattern had matured. The glyphs had begun appearing outside Wren's Hollow, etched into stones miles away, carved beneath pews in churches that had never heard the Morwyn name, sewn into shrouds of the freshly dead. People began dreaming in spirals. One doctor in Tennessee awoke with a name carved into his shoulder, backward, like a mirror's reflection, Morwyn. A miner in Pennsylvania uncovered a chamber with walls that pulsed faintly when silence was complete. He heard breathing. His journal, found weeks later, held only a single entry. "It remembers me before I was born." And what did the pattern want? Not your devotion, not your fear. It wanted your participation, because the Morwyns weren't chosen. They were first. The orchard was a beginning, the house a mouth, and now it speaks through you. If you've heard the whispers, if the image of the house stands clear in your mind's eye, then you are already carrying it, a fold of memory, a seed of recursion, a doorway disguised as a story, and those who remember it fully can no longer leave. The final trap was never the house, it was the remembering. Once the pattern knows your shape, your voice, your rhythm, the way your mind loops at night, it doesn't need your body, it needs your echo. That's what they discovered in 1844 when the last census taker arrived. Name, Henry Bellows, young, logical, unmoved by folklore. He laughed when warned not to cross the orchard line, took notes, drew diagrams, then vanished. But 2 weeks later, a man with his face, same scar, same eyes, was seen in Wren's Hollow at dusk. He was humming, digging a narrow trench with his bare hands, lining it with white feathers. When approached, he whispered, "I am his echo, but I no longer wait for him." He tore the spiral from behind his own ear and placed it in the soil, then smiled, then faded, not into shadow, into misremembering, because that's what the pattern had done. Not stolen lives, but repurposed them. Memories rewritten, events reversed, graves dug for people still breathing, and the town followed suit. Tombstones for infants never born. Chairs set at tables for relatives that never existed. Even sermons began to shift, scriptures replaced by phrases no one had authored. He waits beneath and dreams through us. By spring, the estate had tilted, not physically, ontologically. It existed now, not in space, but in remembrance. A place you reach not by road, but by thinking about it too long. That's how the pattern spreads. It doesn't cross land, it crosses attention. And the more you try to forget, the deeper it roots. So be warned, if you've followed this far, if your ears feel warm, if the scent of salt lingers behind your teeth, you've already arrived. Some arrivals come without footsteps. Just a shift in air, and a knowing that something else now lives behind your thoughts. By the summer of 1844, no one walked to the Morwyn estate. They remembered being there, and in remembering, they returned. Elsie, now nearing her 10th year, no longer spoke aloud. She carried no journal. She cast no shadow. But people dreamed of her, across states, across oceans. A woman in Prague drew her face without knowing why. A boy in New York whispered her name before ever learning to read. Elsie had become the keystone. Not a prophet, not a priestess, a living cipher for the listener, because the listener no longer slept. It had tilted through time, through blood, through repetition, into presence. And now it wore faces. Your neighbor, your mother, your own reflection delayed by half a second. It didn't speak in thunder or ruin. It whispered only one truth. You belong to what remembers you. That is the root of the pattern, the core of recursion, the cost of being seen by something older than language. And the Morwyns, they were not its victims, they were its architects. The estate was never a house. It was a ritual in architecture, a prayer in wood and stone, a body that thinks when no one looks at it. And now, you've looked, you've followed. You've opened yourself to the hum beneath your life, the faint pull, the spiral logic, the songs you can't place. You didn't just hear a tale, you became part of it. So if your dreams begin to loop, if your mirrors show something just out of frame, don't run. You've only one step left. This is where it ends, or where it begins again, because patterns don't die, they fold. And the Morwyn estate? It was never meant to be remembered by accident. It was placed in history, in blood, in thought, to be reawakened by you. If you've heard the whispers, if your breath caught during that name, if part of you felt like you'd always known this story, even before today, then the spiral has taken hold, and there's no going back. Not because you're cursed, but because you've been restructured. Your memory is no longer linear, it's rooted. And roots do not forget. The listener, what the old prayers once called that which tilts the house, has never left. It waits beneath repetition. It feeds not on worship, but recognition. Every time its name is whispered, every time someone draws the spiral, every time a man hears his child speaking a word no one taught them, it grows, in thought, in form, in you. This is not horror. This is inheritance, a spiritual recursion engineered not for salvation, but for remembering the first hunger. Because before scripture, before light, before even fear, there was the echo. And now you've heard it. Now you carry it. So listen, next time you dream, trace the spiral on your skin. Hum the tune under your breath. And when the voice behind the door asks your name, do not answer. Only tilt the house. Let it in. Let it speak. Let it remember itself through you. And when it does, you will not vanish. You will return. Welcome home.